In this video, I'm going to talk to you specifically about divergent evolution and homologous traits. I will also present some of the evidence that we have to support the theory that all of life on Earth arose from a common ancestor. This is a phylogenetic tree showing the relationships between the three major domains of life on Earth: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. A phylogenetic tree is a way of depicting the evolutionary relationships among various species. So if you take a closer look, you'll see that each branch off of the tree represents one or more speciation events, and each node a common ancestor. Humans are classified under the domain eukarya because we contain eukaryotic cells, and the kingdom Animalia. If we trace back the branch or lineage of Animalia, we find that we share a common ancestor with both plants and fungi. When we trace even further back, we find the common ancestor of both eukaryotes and archaea, and even further back, we find the common ancestor of bacteria and archaea. Note that the common ancestor of eukaryotes and archaea is more recent, or further out towards the end of the branch, than the common ancestor of eukaryotes and bacteria is, indicating that eukaryotes are actually more closely related to archaea than we are to bacteria. Finally, if we trace our lineage all the way to the bottom of the tree, we can find the common ancestor of all of life on Earth. Now, before we move on, I just want to remind you that the only reason evolution can take place is because random genetic mutations are arising all the time. And it's these genetic mutations that are the raw material that natural selection has to work with. However, keep in mind that the mutations themselves are not enough. In order for natural selection to take place, the environmental conditions have to be just right and create a scenario where one of these mutations not only increases an organism's survival, but also increases the amount of offspring that it has relative to other organisms that are living at the same time. The result of natural selection, then, is that over time, certain traits become more common than others. And in this way, the population changes. Now here, I really want to emphasize that it's the population and not the individual that's changing over time. And this is because if you think about it, each individual is stuck with the genes they were born with for their entire lives. Your genes are never going to change. Rather, it is the number of offspring each individual contributes to the population that causes this change over time. If the population changes enough over time, and the environment creates conditions where gene pools are isolated from one another, this accumulation of differences can lead to speciation events, resulting in what we call divergent evolution. Now, diverge essentially means to start from the same spot and head in different directions. So divergent evolution means that through speciation events, a single common ancestor has evolved into two or more different species. Over time, this process has led to the incredible diversity of organisms that we see today on Earth. But how do we know this really happened? I'm going to take you through some of the evidence we have to support this theory. Several lines of biological evidence support the theory that all of life on Earth descended from a common ancestor. These include anatomical similarities between organisms, vestigial traits that remain in modern species, shared developmental pathways between even distantly related species, fossil evidence and distribution of organisms on Earth, and finally, the genetic similarities we see between every single species that's alive on Earth today. Let's zoom in on this phylogenetic tree of vertebrates and examine some of this evidence in some of the mammals that we should be familiar with. The first line of evidence that supports this idea that all of life descended from a common ancestor is that different species share anatomical similarities. And this makes sense to us, right? We know that even though all of the species pictured here look different and cannot interbreed, they share many basic characteristics, such as forelimbs, hind limbs. They all have eyes, nose, and a mouth. And this isn't actually surprising to us because we're all very familiar with it. But what about on the inside, right? If they're all different, we might expect that the insides or the bones or the organs would all be different in different species. However, that is not actually what we find. When we take a look inside the forelimb of a lion, a chimpanzee, and a human, we find that they actually all contain the same number and type of bones. This is an example of a homologous trait, or a trait that is similar in different species because they both evolved from a common ancestor that also contained that trait. But what about the mammals that look very different on the outside, like sea lions or bats? What do we find when we examine their forelimbs? We actually find that though they have been slightly modified to perform special functions, like flying in the bat, their forelimbs still contain the same basic structure and number of bones. This is an example of morphological homology, and again, it indicates that the ancestor of all mammals also had a forelimb that contained this bone structure. A second line of evidence that supports descent from a common ancestor is the presence of vestigial traits that remain in modern species. A vestigial trait is simply a homologous structure that has lost all or most of the original function that it served in the ancestor. Some familiar examples of vestigial traits present in humans would be the tailbone and the presence of goosebumps, both of which played an important role in our common ancestor, but have very little functionality today in humans. A third line of evidence is the presence of the developmental homologies we see between even very distantly related species. If we closely study the structures present during the early stages of development in species even as distantly related as a human and a snake or a fish, for example, we find that many of the structures are nearly identical. However, as the embryos further develop, these identical structures eventually give rise to very different structures during adulthood. For example, the structure in the embryo that develops into the human jawbone is the same structure that eventually develops into the bones that support the gills of fish. The fossil record is another line of evidence that illustrates how organisms have evolved over time here on Earth. By examining the fossils and following the succession of organisms through determining the age of the rocks that contain the fossils, we can see that the living organisms inhabiting our world today are similar, but not identical to organisms that are represented in fossils. And as we continue to examine older and older rock deposits, the fossils continue to change as well, thus providing us with a record of the species that were once common but are now extinct and how these species changed and evolved over time. And perhaps the strongest piece of evidence to support the theory that all of life evolved from a common ancestor here on Earth is the fact that every living creature here, all the way from mammals to jellyfish, bacteria, and plants, all of them use DNA to store and pass on their genetic information. And the DNA in every living organism is made up of the same 4 nucleotides. Not only that, but the instructions contained in the DNA are read using an identical decoding mechanism, and the proteins that are made as a result are all constructed of the same amino acids. This is known as genetic homology, And it provides us with very strong evidence that all of life on Earth likely evolved from a common ancestor. So in this video, we covered divergent evolution. And remember, this is the idea that all of life on Earth evolved from a common ancestor. And I've also shown you much of the evidence that supports this theory. And now let me remind you that a theory is pretty much as good as it gets in science. It's the gold standard. By the time something becomes a theory, it means that all of the evidence we have is in favor of that theory. And secondly, we went over homologous traits. Now remember, homologous traits are those that indicate a common ancestry, meaning that if two closely related species have a similar trait, their common ancestor also had that trait.